Hello and welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul. This one is an important one if you're studying about children's language development. What I'm going to talk through are 18 really important theories for doing well in the exam. So let's go. 18 theories for CLD speech. Theory number one is behaviourism. This is the work of B.F. Skinner, an American psychologist, who claimed that the learning of language is like the learning of everything else, a very straightforward process that's all about imitation and copying. He called it operant conditioning. He did lots of experiments on rats and pigeons, but he believed that children develop language through the same process of responding to both positive and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, the child says something and the adults seem to understand it, or they answer the question, or they respond to an instruction. So positive reinforcement. And on the other hand, negative reinforcement, where the child says something and the caregiver around them doesn't respond or doesn't understand, and therefore the child will be discouraged from using that language form again. So operant conditioning is all about positive and negative reinforcement. And Skinner claimed that all children are born with a tabula rasa, to give it its fancy Latin term, a blank slate. They know nothing about the world, they know nothing about language, and they learn simply through imitation. Now, in the exam, you have to evaluate that kind of claim, and you'll get a transcript, and it may well be that there's lots of features in the transcript that support the behaviourist approach. Look at the Lexis being used both by the adults and the children. Maybe you'll find a child who is repeating something that the child says and being rewarded by the parent. That's behaviourism. Maybe you'll find in the syntactical structures being used by the child and by the adult some kind of copying going on. That's behaviourism. Maybe you'll see some aspect of phonology where the child is repeating the phonemes of a particular piece of Lexis. That is behaviourism. So no doubt you will find for yourself in some data some good evidence to support Skinner's notion of behaviourism. But of course, you have to evaluate, which means you have to critique some of these claims. And in that criticism, you should draw attention to some of the limitations of behaviourism. And here are 4 of them. Limitation 1. If you've ever spent 5 minutes with a child, you'll know that children actually rarely simply repeat what adults say. Even though the adults are trying to get them to repeat things, often children don't do it. Secondly, children often make creative overgeneralizations, so-called virtuous errors. Things like, I eated my tea, mummy, or I saw sheeps in the field. So sheeps and eated are perfectly logical but non-standard utterances. And what they suggest is that the child is not just copying language that they hear around them, but they are creatively working out grammatical rules. Another possible limitation with behaviourism is the idea that actually children, no matter what language they're speaking and no matter where they are in the world, they tend to go through the same predictable stages of development, whatever the input. So this sort of throws into question the importance of positive and negative reinforcement from adults. And then finally, few children actually receive explicit grammatical correction. And it was Catherine Nelson back in the 1970s who drew attention to the fact that when parents are talking with children, parents rightly are more interested in 2 things: politeness and truth value, rather than being interested so much in the grammatical accuracy of their talk. Okay, so behaviourism has some quite considerable limitations to it. CLD theory number 2, nativism, aka innateness, the brainchild of one Noam Chomsky, and a current day proponent of nativism would be Steven Pinker. They argued that the human brain has this naturally programmed ability to learn language. The title of Steven Pinker's book is The Language Instinct. this language instinct enables children to work out the language system in terms of grammar and syntax. So they come up with the acronym of LAD, the Language Acquisition Device, and this goes against the traditionally held view that the human brain is a tabula rasa, it's a blank slate, because what they're arguing is that the mind is sort of preconditioned for language. So the term universal grammar is used to describe this global capacity to learn languages. And children learn languages at similar rates and similar ways all over the world, no matter what language it is, whether it's Mandarin Chinese, Romanian, or English. And so, as we said on the previous slide, virtuous errors can be used to support the language acquisition device. So a child making an error, in inverted commas, in inflection, grammar, or syntax, while attempting to apply these rules. Okay, so nativism. Now, as I said before, you need to be able to evaluate what's going on here. And in the exam, quite often they pick transcripts that have examples of this creative overgeneralizations, virtuous errors that show some supporting evidence for nativism. Here are some limitations, however, of nativism. Another linguist called Isaac Slabin argued that actually a child is not born with a set of specific linguistic categories, but rather they have a sort of process mechanism, i.e. a generalized set of procedures and inference rules that not only enable them to work out language, but also other elements as well. So he argued that there isn't such a thing as a separate language acquisition device. Another possible limitation that you could say with Chomsky's idea is that it was entirely theoretical and it wasn't actually based on linguistic data. Some people have argued about nativism that actually it seems to downplay the part played by interaction between children and carers. There's not enough focus put on social interaction. Other people have criticised nativism because it doesn't seem to recognise the functions, the motivations and the purposes behind children's language. It's a good idea if you're picking apart nativism to reference the case study, the 1977 case study of the American boy Jim, and this was alluded to in Bard and Sachs's research. So Jim was a hearing child of deaf parents who spent the first 3 or 4 years of his life plonked in front of the TV, limited exposure to the outside world, but lots of listening to the television. And he ended up with his language considerably delayed, with an unusually monotonous intonation pattern and a limited vocabulary. So the speech therapists got to him and did some fantastic work with him. But what this case study demonstrates really is the importance of interaction, that having a language acquisition device in itself is not necessarily going to result in fluent language. Okay, CLD theory number 3 is cognitive theory. And here we have Jean Piaget, a Swiss psychologist. And if you want to summarize cognitive theory in 3 words, it's the idea that language tracks thought. So your thinking level, your thought processes are the most important thing. Your thinking is a precursor to your ability to articulate in language. And he suggested that therefore that children have to go through these predictable stages of cognitive development. And here are these stages. Your first 2 years of your life are the sensory motor stage, where it's all about movement and the senses. And any language that the child produces is bound to be sort of deictical. It's bound in the here and now, and it's usually about kind of concrete objects and things right in front of them. So that's the sensory motor stage. And then you move into the pre-operational stage, which is kind of 2 years old, right through into sort of early primary skills, 6 or 7 years old, where asking questions becomes an important element, and imagination and playing games is important as well. You then move into what's called the concrete operational stage from 6 or 7 years old, really right through to the beginning of secondary school, where you get more of a capacity for organisation, categorisation, so more abstract level of thinking, concrete operational. And then finally, his fourth stage is formal operational. Okay, so Piaget focuses on the need for conceptual understanding to be present before language can reflect it. So in this, when you've got a transcript in front of you, look out for certain specific grammatical features which might give you a clue as to the cognitive level of the child. For example, is this child able to use comparative or superlative adjectives? If they do, then obviously shows that they are able to understand concepts of size and scale. Is the child able to use the passive voice? Can they say things like the ball was kicked by the boy rather than the boy kicked the ball? Can they do subordination in complex sentences? So can they produce complex sentences? And if they can, then that suggests that maybe this is a child who's moving into the concrete operational stage. Okay, so in terms of evaluation of this, it's certainly possible looking at early children's language to link their conceptual development to their linguistic development. And certainly in the early stages, it's good to point out about things like object permanence. Object permanence is the idea that a child begins to understand abstract ideas, i.e. they understand that an object is permanent even though it's not in your sight. So once you've understood object permanence, then you can talk about what's going on next door, even though you can't see what's going on next door. And you can talk about what happened yesterday, even though it's obviously not in front of you, what happened yesterday. Okay, but as the child gets older, it does become harder to make clear links between cognitive level and language. And indeed, some studies have focused on children who have learned to speak fluently despite having a relatively low cognitive level, so-called cocktail party chatterers, in the words of Gene Aitchison, who can construct very advanced, sophisticated levels of language, but talk nonsense. Theory number 4 is social interactionism. So here, this is the work of Jerome Bruner, who coins the idea of child-directed speech. He basically rejected Chomsky's language acquisition device, and he really focused on the importance of a children's interaction with caregivers. And he's saying that's the key to language development. So for this, if you've got a transcript, you're looking at the interaction between the child and the people around them. And in response to Chomsky's LAD, he came up with his own funny acronym, LAS. That's the Language Acquisition Support System, which refers to that special kind of social act that caregivers do in order to break down language for them, child-directed speech. So Bruner suggested that the way in which carers sort of question and encourage and support the child through these special scaffolding techniques, these are the really important things that enable children to gradually develop their speech. Okay, so here you're looking at transcripts at the interactions between the children and people around them. Okay, but in terms of evaluation, well, obviously look out for child-directed speech features. There are a whole list of them. They're listed in the textbook. I've just put 3 in here. So repetition of key lexis by adults, simplification of certain sentence constructions, and over-articulation of certain phonemes are all good examples of child-directed speech. But in terms of evaluating, you could draw attention to the sort of cross-cultural research that's been done, which says that children of all backgrounds and languages tend to progress through similar stages predictably. So if that's the case, this sort of challenges the idea that being exposed to child-directed speech is so important. Okay, and in fact, there are some cultures, like the famous Kaluli tribe, which is again mentioned in the AQA textbook, the Kaluli tribe in Papua New Guinea, north of Australia, who don't appear to use CDS at all. They completely ignore their younger children. Yet those youngsters seem to develop language at exactly the same rate as elsewhere. So it does rather draw into question the importance of social interactionism. Theory number 5 is the structuralist approach. For this one, I don't have a particular theorist, but according to this theory, the child passes through certain stages of language usage. Doesn't matter which language that you're speaking, doesn't matter where in the world you are. Children tend to go through predictable phases of language usage, and here they are. First of all, you've got your pre-verbal stage in the first year of your life. Initially, you're crying. Then you're cooing, which is a bit more controlled because what you're doing is you're letting out vowel sounds from the back of your mouth. And then you're babbling. So the feature of babbling is that it's a combination of vowels and consonants. There are two kinds of babbling. There's reduplicated babbling, which comes first, which is the repetition of the same consonant and the same vowel again and again. Ba 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 ba. And then there's variegated babbling, which has consonants and vowels but different sounds. Wa kutipa mamwa. Those are pre-verbal stage features. Notice that none of this is actually to do with semantics and meanings, and it's basically about the child giving a good workout to the mouth in order to try and get your tongue around the 44 phonemes of English, the pre-verbal stage. You then move into the holophastic stage. This is one-word utterances. Just because a child is saying one word doesn't necessarily mean that they're just labeling something. It may be that those one-word utterances stand for an entire sentence. Okay, so sausage, the child cries, which could mean, could you get me another sausage, please? So it could be a request to an adult. So this holophastic stage usually happens at about a year, and it goes on for something like 6 months. We then, logically enough, go into the two-word stage, and here this is important in terms of grammar, because the word order here starts to follow the conventional English syntactical patterns. In a way, it's the beginning of grammar, and various linguists have categorized these patterns. I've put down here Roger Brown. So he did some research ages ago in the 1970s, which seems to suggest 8 categories of two-word utterances. I've put 3 down there. Agent plus action, as in daddy go. Action plus location, as in run garden. And possessor plus possession, as in granny gloves. So once you get to round about 2 years old, you're starting to go all telegraphic. This is where you omit grammatical lexis, so grammar words like connectives and prepositions and definite article and indefinite article and primary auxiliary verbs. So you miss those minor words out, and your language tends to be dominated by lexical lexis, i.e. meaning words like nouns, adjectives, verbs and adverbs. And that's interesting from a nativist point of view, because that kind of seems to imply that a child has a kind of natural filter where they're filtering out some of these words that they're hearing, because statistically the most common words that children will be hearing will be grammar words. There'll be words like and the and to. So these are not the first words that children say. The first words that children say are lexical, pieces of lexical lexis. So that's the telegraphic stage, which can last something like a year before you end up in the post-telegraphic stage. So that is theory number 5, the structuralist approach. And when you've got a transcript in the exam, be prepared to be labeling what level you think that child has probably reached without being too dogmatic about it, because obviously you've only got a very limited amount of data, but don't try and sound too certain about it. Right, theory number 6 is the functional approach. This is Michael Halliday, as in we're all going on a Michael Halliday. And he did research with his son and looking at the different purposes of the language behind his son's language. So he identified 7 different functions that might be served when a child uses language in their very early years. And for him, the purposes, the functions, the motivations behind the language are the most important thing to look at. Not so much the structures, more to do with what the child is trying to do with language. And so he came up with these 7 different functions, which are absolutely crucial for you to be learning. His first 4 functions are these. So instrumental, which means expressing some kind of basic need, like saying me hungry. Regulatory, which is telling somebody to do something, like get sweets. Interactional, which is kind of phatic communication that's all about establishing and keeping relationships going, like love you daddy. And personal, which is talking about like personal tastes, like I like sausages. So according to Halliday, these are the sort of first 4 purposes that you're likely to hear in a child's speech. And then later on, you're going to be coming across heuristic purposes. Heuristic language is asking questions and finding out about the world around you. So all those annoying questions that all 4-year-olds say, that's heuristic language. You've got imaginative language, which of course in Piaget's second stage, the pre-operational stage, children are likely to be doing, so they are playing through language. And then finally, you've got representational language, which is all about communicating information. So they're very important ones to learn. Halliday is not the only functional show in town, because there is an alternative here, John Doerr, which used to be quoted in the older textbooks, but I haven't seen in the more recent ones. So this is definitely worth learning. These functions are worth applying to younger children who are just going into the holophrastic stage. So we have labeling, where a child touches a doll's eyes and says eyes. We have repeating what an adult has just said. We have answering an adult's question. We have requesting action, unable to push a peg through a hole, says uh-oh, while looking at a parent. And we have calling, shouting for a parent across the room. And the final 3 would be greeting, like shouting hi, protesting, shouting when the parent attempts to put a shoe on, and practicing, uttering words when the personal object is not present. You can see that some of these link in with the Halliday ones. So, for example, requesting action is regulatory language. But that's quite a useful set of functions for children who are in that holophrastic stage. Theory number 7, and we're coming up to nearly halfway through. Theory number 7 is scaffolding. This is everyone's favorite 1930s Russian linguist, Lev Vygotsky, or in the words of the Beatles, all you need is Lev. Yes, there he is. And Lev did a lot of work on learning, how people learn, the processes of learning, and his focus really was on the importance of doing. That learning is an active, proactive process. It's not just passive. And he focused also on the importance of the caregiver as being this catalyst for learning, and he called the caregiver a MKO, a more knowledgeable other. So a bit like social interactionism, it's putting the importance on the interaction between the child and the adult, and he's arguing that your MKO works through language to move the child through the ZPD, that's the zone of proximal development, which is the area just beyond what a child is able to do already. Okay, so as I've said, that supports Bruner's theory of social interactionism. We're into number 8 now, folks. This is the critical period hypothesis. This was created by Eric Lenneberg, an American psychologist. He coined this term critical period. He thought that there was a particular window of opportunity where children are most ripe for learning language. The synapses are working incredibly hard at that time, and that actually social interaction and exposure to language were absolutely crucial for a child to be gaining full mastery of the language. And if you had some kind of strange circumstances in which the child missed this window of opportunity, then it would be almost impossible for the child to become a fluent speaker in that language. And of course, this links in with the case, the very tragic case of Jeannie, who was found in a Los Angeles garage in 1970, having been left isolated for something like 13 years, 12, 13 years, with no social interaction and no talk at all. So she was discovered at the age of 13. There was a lot of hothouse English tutoring done with her to try and make sure that she could talk. But despite all of that, she only acquired a very, very basic level of language. She was able to articulate some words, but was quite unable to put those words into successful standard English syntactical structures. So that is evidence that kind of supports Eric Lenneberg's critical period hypothesis. This is the halfway mark, and then number 9 is the Wug Test, which was done by Jean Burko Gleason decades and decades ago. She did this in 1958 because she supported Chomsky's nativist idea. So she created this test that children, and what the test is set up to do is to show that children actually have a much more sophisticated understanding of linguistic morphology, which means the inflections that you put on the ends of words, morphology than they have been taught explicitly. So she would show them pictures of imaginary pseudo-animals with made-up names and say, this is a wug, now there are 2 of them, there are 2, and then the child would say, wugs. So, as I say, she uses pseudo words because she needs to ensure that the child has never been exposed to the word previously, and therefore is not just remembering something in a kind of behaviourist way. And what she discovered is that 76% of 4 to 5-year-olds were able to deduce what the plural of the noun wug would be alongside other inflectional endings. So that seems to suggest that children understand grammatical rules and that they have this ability to transfer them to other examples. So it supports Chomsky's nativist theory. Okay, theory number 10 this should be. I put 9 on there, but it's actually 10. This is the Fis Phenomenon. And this is the aforementioned Burko with somebody called Roger Brown. And this is about the child's ability to understand and articulate phonemes of English. So the research explored the extent to which children can actually hear the correct pronunciation of words, but they're not necessarily able to articulate those phonemes themselves. Okay, so it was a 1960s study, and there was this child who rejected the adult's articulation of the noun fish as fis, because annoyingly the adult kept calling a fish a fis, but the child themselves couldn't pronounce fish, so they kept using the word fis themselves, if that makes any sense. So it demonstrates that a child may be unable to articulate certain phonemes, even though they can differentiate in sound between different phonemes. So this kind of challenges Skinner's behaviourist theory, because what it suggests is that children can't simply just imitate language, they have to have reached a certain developmental stage in order to do so. Right, we're back on track with our numbers here because number 11 is the IRF. This is not the IRA, this is the IRF structure, and this is put forward by 2 linguists called Sinclair and Coulthard. There's Sinclair. IRF stands for Initiation, Response, Feedback. So this is looking at the sort of adjacency exchanges that people take part in everyday conversation, and is a big feature in child-directed speech, where often you get 3-part adjacency exchanges. A speaker starts a conversation, a second speaker responds, and then the first speaker then provides some feedback. And here's an example. So there is your first part. What do we say to grandma? That is your initiation. The child says, "Thank you for the sweets." That's the response. And then there's the parent's feedback. "Well done, Sam." So in order for children to learn language, it's not simply about learning bits of Lexis and then stringing them together into sentences. It's also about these ritualistic discourse structures that habitually we use all of the time, such as this IRF. And it demonstrates how questioning and evaluating are really important aspects of child-directed speech. So that's number 11, IRF structure, with Sinclair and Coulthard. We're now into number 12, and this is about early words. Right, the first words that children are likely to be uttering. This is research done by Catherine Nelson, again it's quite old, it's from the 1970s, but she grouped together into 4 categories the early words used by children. She found that something like 60% of the first words used by children in the holophastic stage when they're 1 year old are naming words. So they tend to be concrete objects, 60%. The second biggest category is verbs, to denote actions, or sometimes location words such as up and down. So nouns, verbs, and then third you've got modifiers, which mean adjectives like nice. And then finally you've got personal or social words that make up about 8% of the sample. These are the kind of ritualistic formulaic collocations that we say to children all the time. Things like all gone now, or night night, bedtime, etc. So that's quite a handy thing to remember about when, if you've got in the exam, you've got a transcript of a child who is in this holophastic stage. Are they following the kind of patterns that Catherine Nelson was suggesting were characteristic of those first words? The thing to say about first words is that the early vocabulary tends to be lexical Lexis rather than grammatical Lexis. So by lexical Lexis, I mean things like verbs, nouns, adjectives, and adverbs, things that have semantic meaning. And it doesn't tend to be grammatical words like the or and. Here is a 13th piece of theory about CLD. This is to do with semantic development. This is put forward by Eve Clark. She focused on the way that children attribute meaning to lexical choices. And she identified the following features which are characteristic of early children's semantics. First of all, you've got overextension. So overextension is where a child might use a word to refer to several different but related things. So cat for any animal that's got 4 legs. That's an example of overextension. And there was another researcher called Rescorla who divided overextension further into 2 subcategories. First of all, you've got the more straightforward categorical overextension, where a word is used to refer to things in a similar category. So the word car is used to describe all vehicles. And then you've got the more subtle analogical overextension, where people are scratching their heads around the child thinking, what do they mean? So this is where a word is used to refer to something not in the same category, but the child is making some kind of physical or functional link. So for example, they might be picking up a cup and calling it a bath because it's a container. So it's more subtle, and I suppose in a way it kind of gives supporting evidence to nativism, Chomsky's idea that children they might have very limited vocabulary, but their thinking skills are actually very developed. The other element on there, which you can't see on the bottom of the slide, is underextension. So underextension is where a child uses a word too narrowly. So they might use the word shoes to refer to their own dirty trainers, but they won't use the word shoes to refer to any other kind of footwear that's in the house. So number 13 is about children's semantic development. Number 14 is further about lexical development, and this is work done by Jean Aitchison, who claimed that there are actually three broad stages in children's lexical development. The first stage she calls labelling. So this is that very simple process where a child links a sound to an object. They're able to call something by its kind of standard name. She calls this labelling. She then has another category which she calls packaging. This is where a child begins to understand a range of meanings. So they've got this word bottle, and they begin to understand that bottles can have different shapes and sizes. They've got a similar function, but they've got different shapes and sizes. So she's calling this packaging. And then finally, the more subtle and extensive use of vocabulary is network building, where the child makes connections between words. They understand antonyms, which are opposites, like hot and cold, good and bad, or synonyms, so words that have very similar meanings. And so when the child is building vocabulary, network building, that leads to an understanding of the difference between hypernyms and hyponyms. Hypernyms, that's Hyper, those are broad umbrella terms, like furniture, for example, is a hypernym. Whereas hyponym, Hypo, I know it's annoying, Hypo, these are the more specific things within the broad H. Hyponym, so chair, stool, table, those are examples of hyponyms. So if a child is beginning to understand these more subtle relationships between things, according to Jean Aitchison, she is network building. Right, we're now on to grammatical development. We're on the last throes of these theories. This is Roger Brown, did research way back again in the 1970s, and his 1973 study suggested that actually children learn to use inflections in a predictable order. It's not just random, okay, which again is further evidence which supports the nativist idea. It's not just about copying and random. It's actually very predictable, the stages that children go through. And here are the stages of grammar. Look at the top two there. So the first most common inflectional ending that children are able to do in a standard way is the ing ending. It's the progressive form of the verb, that velar nasal ing sound. Children are most likely to do that. And the second most common one is the plural s, as in wugs. You've then got these middle ones that come a bit later. You've got the possessive s, like Teddy's chair. You've got the use of articles, a and an and the, and you've got the past tense form of the verb kicked. And then the final lot of grammatical inflections that children tend to master come later. They're things like the third person singular s, as in she loves me, yeah, yeah, with the s on the end of there, which is not a plural. That's a third person present simple singular form. And then finally, the auxiliary verb, which is a tricky little beast, the verb to be, because it changes according to the number of the pronoun, as in first person, I am, second person, you are, third person, he, she, or it is. So because it's so changeable, presumably that's the reason why that comes later on. And another researcher called Katamba found that actually there was very little connection between the order in which these children are learning these inflections and the order that they are hearing them in adults' speech. So again, it's further evidence that supports the idea that children have some kind of language mechanism that's inside them. Our last three are to do with one particular researcher called Ursula Bellucci, who did research, you'll never guess it, yes, in the 1960s and the 1970s, about grammatical development. And she looked, first of all, at pronoun development, and she discovered that children actually develop their use of pronouns in predictable stages. And here they are. The first stage is basically a child ignores using a pronoun, and sensibly they nominalize instead, which means using a name rather than a pronoun. So Sam give daddy cake. And that's sensible because, of course, pronouns are difficult things. They're completely dialectical. They depend on the context. They also depend upon the speaker, the relationship of the speaker to the listener as well. So they are difficult things. So first of all, the child uses a name rather than a pronoun. But according to Bernoulli in the second stage, then the child will start to use pronouns. They'll start to use subject and object pronouns, but they won't be able to consistently apply this in a standard way. So they'll say things like, and all 2-year-olds do this, me give cake to daddy, whereas instead of using the first person singular subject, they're using the first person singular object form of the pronoun. And then the third stage is moving towards standard English, where the child is beginning to apply subject and object pronouns like I gave the cake to him. Okay, so pronouns are really useful things to look in on transcripts in the exam, as are negative sentences, where you're negating a positive statement. Again, this is research done by Ursula Bernoulli, and she discovered that children develop their use of negative sentence constructions in predictable stages. The first stage, the child will just tend to put a negating adverb at the beginning of an utterance. So they'll just say something like no juice when they say I don't want any juice. The second stage is where the child starts to use no or not, kind of in the middle of the phrase or the clause in front of the verb. So the negating word is moving to the right sort of place in the statement, as in I not like it. Notice that it's not standard English at this point, but the negating word is moving to the right area. And then thirdly, the child starts to use the more standard form, where they're integrating into the negating sentence things like the primary and modal auxiliary verbs, like she can't do it, or I didn't see. Okay, so Bernoulli says there are 3 stages that children go through in negating sentences. And the very last one that I can give you of these 18 CLD theorists is stages in questions, where Ursula Bernoulli discovered that children actually go through interrogative, the formation of questions in predictable stages as well. Initially, children just use rising intonation, go walk, and in fact there is some evidence to suggest that even at the holophrastic stage, in one-word utterances, children are doing fancy things with their intonational patterns in order to do things like ask questions. Stage 2 would be the inclusion of using interrogative pronouns. These are your WH words like what, who, where. And remember how that links in with Jean Piaget's pre-operational stage 2, where he's saying that children have this heuristic tendency to be asking questions about the things around them. And then finally, stage 3, children start to do things like the subject-verb inversion, and they start to use auxiliary verbs, whether that be primary auxiliary or modal auxiliary verbs. So they're starting to say things like, can you see it? And what's mummy doing? So, according to Ursula Bernoulli, children tend to go through 3 stages of interrogative development. We have come to the end of our mammoth video. Now what you need to do is, you need to stop the video, get a piece of paper, write down as many of those theories and ideas as you can. These are absolutely crucial for you getting a decent mark on your CLD English Language A-Level essay question in the exam. On the AQA one that we do, half of the marks come for your AO2, so it's pretty important. Here they are again: Behaviourism, B.F. Skinner; Nativism, Noam Chomsky; Cognitive theory, Jean Piaget; Social Interactionism, Jerome Bruno; Structuralism; Functional theory, Michael Halliday and John Dahl; Scaffolding, Vygotsky; Critical period hypothesis, Eric Lenneberg; The Wug Test, Jean Burko; the Fis Phenomenon, Burko and Brown; IRF Structure, Sinclair and Coulthard; Early Lexis, Nelson; Semantic Development, E. Clark. Lexical Development, G. Aitchison. Grammatical Development, Roger Brown. And then those 3 ones by Ursula Bellugi, which are about the children's development of pronouns, negatives, and interrogatives. Learn all of this stuff, and you are putting yourself in a really good position to do well in the exam. I'm going to leave it there. I am going to make another CLD video which is about speech, so that will be coming your way fairly soon. Goodbye.